The room is quiet. The candle is lit. Tonight, we begin a story that begins in a granary. 7,500 years ago, in a village along the Nile, in a place we now call Mosta Jeddah, someone dug a grave in the sand. Into that grave they placed a man. Beside the man they placed a small spotted cat. Beside the cat they placed a young gazelle. And then they covered all three with earth, and the wind blew over the spot, and the centuries passed, and the village forgot, and the river shifted in its bed, until in the 1930s an English archaeologist named Guy Brunton came down from Cairo with a brush and a notebook and lifted the sand away. The cat is still there in the photograph he took. So is the gazelle. So is the man. We do not know who he was. We do not know what the cat was to him. We do not know what the gazelle was to the cat. We have only the grave, in the order someone left it, with the three of them lying together as they have lain since around 5,500 years before the birth of Christ. Tonight, we are going to walk back to that grave. And then, slowly, over the chapters that follow, we are going to ask the question the grave itself is asking. What was the cat doing there? I should say, before we go any further, that I am Iris. I keep the drowsy atelier on the nights the lamps are low and the books are open, and I am very glad you are here. The hour ahead of us is a long one. 6 chapters, beginning here in a predynastic grain store and ending, if all goes well, with a tabby asleep on a couch in a house in our own century. The thread that runs between those two scenes is the thread of one of the longest, strangest, most quietly consequential partnerships in the history of our species. Tonight, the partnership begins. So pour the tea, or do not. Pull the blanket up, or do not. Settle, in whatever way settles you. There is no hurry. The cat in the granary has been waiting for thousands of years to be looked at properly. We can take our time. Begin with the animal. Before there was a cat in any human house, there was the African wildcat. Its proper name, in the dry Latin of the taxonomists, is Felis sylvestris libica. It is a small, slender, sandy-coated cat, weighing perhaps 8 pounds, with long legs and a tabby pattern that still, today, runs faintly through the coat of almost every domestic cat alive. It lives across North Africa, into the Levant, out into the dry margins of Mesopotamia. It hunts at dawn and at dusk. It is, by temperament, solitary and cautious. It is not, by any measure a biologist would use in the year 600 before Christ, a candidate for domestication. It is too independent. It does not run in packs the way wolves do. It does not herd or follow a lead animal the way sheep and goats do. It cannot be driven. It cannot be lured by simple social bonds, the way the dog already had been, thousands of years earlier, in the cold north. The African wildcat does not need us. And then, somewhere along the Nile, somewhere in the long slow predynastic centuries, it begins, on its own terms, to come closer. The reason it comes closer is grain. Around 6,000 years before Christ, in the long fertile mud of the Nile floodplain, the people who would one day be Egyptians begin to farm in earnest. They plant emmer wheat and barley. They harvest more than they can eat. They store the surplus in pits and in jars and, eventually, in built granaries, mud brick rooms with sealed doors and high thresholds, designed to keep the harvest dry through the long months between flood and flood. The grain attracts mice. The mice attract snakes. The snakes attract, in the long run, every kind of trouble a person living off a fixed harvest can imagine. And the mice, also, attract a small sandy-coated cat from the desert edge. She does not come for the people. She comes for the mice. She finds them in numbers she has never encountered anywhere in the wild. She catches one. She catches another. She does not leave. And the people, watching her from the granary door, do not chase her away. This is the founding bargain. The cat is in the granary because there is more food there than anywhere in her natural range. The people tolerate her because she is killing the small grey things that have been eating their winter. Neither party has signed anything. Neither party has decided anything. But by the time the bargain has run for a few hundred generations, the cat is no longer quite a wildcat, and the granary is no longer quite without a cat. This is what biologists now call commensal domestication. It is the slow kind. It is not the fast, deliberate kind, where a person walks into a forest, picks up a wolf cub, and decides to raise it as a dog. It is the kind where the animal chooses the human settlement before the human ever chooses the animal. It happened, almost certainly, with the rat. It happened with the house mouse itself. It happened with the sparrow and the pigeon. And it happened, on the slowest schedule of all of them, with the cat. The genetic evidence, and we will come back to the genetic evidence in the final chapter of this hour, because in the last 20 years it has rewritten almost everything we thought we knew. The genetic evidence suggests that every domestic cat alive today descends from a small founding population of African wildcats that came in from the granary edge somewhere in the broad band of land that runs from the Nile Delta east into the Fertile Crescent. The population is small. The window is long. The process, when it happens, does not look like an event. It looks like a habit, which slowly, over centuries, becomes a relationship. Now back to Moster Jeddah. The site sits on the east bank of the Nile, about 300 kilometers south of modern Cairo. It is a predynastic settlement and cemetery, used for hundreds of years before Egypt became Egypt, before there was a pharaoh, before there was a unified kingdom, before there was hieroglyphic writing. Guy Brunton excavated it in 1928 and the early 1930s. Among the graves he opened was one we now refer to, with the dry precision of museum catalogues, as Grave 1684. In that grave he found the skeleton of a young man. Beside the man, on his left, he found the skeleton of a small cat. Beside the cat he found the skeleton of a juvenile gazelle. The bones were articulated, which is to say still arranged in the order they had been when the bodies were placed in the ground. The cat had not been hunted by the man, and the gazelle had not been hunted by the cat. All three had been buried together, deliberately, in a single act, around 5,500 years before Christ. The grave is the earliest cat and human burial we have anywhere in the world. It predates the pyramids by more than 2,000 years. I want to be careful here, because the Moster Jeddah grave is a real piece of evidence, and like every real piece of evidence it can be made to say more than it actually does. What we have is 3 bodies in a single grave. What we do not have is any inscription, any text, any image, any explanation. The man is anonymous. The cat is anonymous. The gazelle is anonymous. We do not know whether the cat was the man's companion, or whether all 3 died together in a single event, or whether the grave was a ritual deposit in which the animals were sacrificed to accompany the man into whatever came next. We do not know whether the cat was a wildcat brought in for the occasion, or whether it was already, in some sense, his cat. We have generations of scholarly argument about each of these possibilities, and none of them has been settled, and none of them is likely to be. What we have is the order of the bodies. The cat is on the left of the man. The gazelle is on the left of the cat. And the 3 of them lie there now, in the dirt, where they have lain since the year 5500 before Christ, as still and as silent as the day they were covered. What the grave tells us, even without an inscription, is that by 5,500 years before Christ, in this particular village on the Nile, a cat was important enough to a person that the 2 of them were buried together. That is not nothing. In the broad history of human and animal relationships, the cat is a latecomer. The dog had been buried beside its people for nearly 10,000 years already by the time someone closed the lid of Grave 1684. But the gap was closing. Somewhere in the slow centuries between the founding bargain at the granary door and the careful arrangement of 3 bodies in a predynastic grave, the wildcat had become close enough to its humans that one of them, at the end of his life, took the cat with him. We do not know what he called it. We do not know if he called it anything. The Egyptian word for cat, the one we will spend the rest of this hour following, has not yet been written down. It will not be written down for thousands of years. But the word, when it finally arrives, will be the sound a cat makes. MIW. It is a word the cat almost certainly taught the people, rather than the other way around. Move forward 2,000 years from the Moster Jeddah grave. The Nile Valley is now united under a single pharaoh. The pyramids of Giza are being built. The hieroglyphic script is mature. The cat begins, in this period, to appear in tomb paintings. She is shown under chairs, in domestic scenes, alongside her people at the dinner table or at the fowling marsh. She wears a collar. She has kittens. She is, by every visual cue available to an Egyptian painter, a member of the household. By the New Kingdom, around 1500 years before Christ, A wealthy Theban official named Nebaman will commission a tomb painting in which his family is shown fowling in the marshes, and beside them, gripping 3 birds in her claws and 1 in her teeth, is a tabby cat. The painting still exists. It is in the British Museum. The cat is mid-leap, eyes wide, fur bristled, every line of her body alive with the same predatory delight she would have brought to the granary door 3,000 years earlier. She is the same animal. The relationship has changed. And here, before we leave the granary and walk into the temple, I want to mark the thing that the next 5 chapters are going to test. The cat in the granary is, at this point in the story, a practical animal. She catches mice. She protects the grain. She is useful in the way a good plough or a good well is useful, and like a good plough she is appreciated and on occasion remembered fondly. What she is not, yet, is sacred. She is not a goddess. She is not the object of pilgrimage. She is not mummified in industrial quantities and shipped, 3,000 years later, by the boatload to be ground into fertilizer in the fields of England. All of that is coming. It is coming over the chapters that follow. But the question we ought to hold in our minds as we walk forward into the temple is the question the Mostajeda grave is already asking. How does a useful animal become a holy one? What had to happen, in the long slow centuries between the granary and the temple, to turn the cat from a tolerated guest into a member of the pantheon? I think the answer, when we get to it, is going to surprise you. But not yet. Tonight, the cat is still in the granary. The wheat is still drying. The mouse is still in the corner. And the candle in the atelier is still burning. There is no hurry. The history is on the page. Stay close. We left the cat in the granary. The wheat was drying. The mouse was in the corner. And the relationship was, by any honest measure, a practical one, a cat doing useful work for a household that, in return, was content to let her in. Tonight we walk a long way from that granary. Tonight we walk to a city in the eastern Nile Delta called Bubastis, in the 7th century before Christ, on a particular spring morning, when the river is in flood and the canals around the temple are full to their banks and the pilgrims are arriving by the boatload. Herodotus, the Greek historian, will tell us that on this day, and on every day of the festival of Bastet, 700,000 people gather in this city. Herodotus will tell us they drink more wine, in the days of this festival, than is drunk in the rest of the Egyptian year combined. Herodotus will tell us a great deal that we have to take with the appropriate amount of salt. But the festival was real. The city was real. The goddess at the center of it was real. And the goddess at the center of it, by the 7th century before Christ, has the body of a woman and the head of a small domestic cat. Tonight we are going to walk back to the moment when the goddess first put on that head. And we are going to ask what changed. To understand Bastet, we have to begin not with a cat at all but with a lioness. In the Old Kingdom of Egypt, the time of the pyramid builders, around 2600 years before Christ, the dangerous, sunburnt powers of the Egyptian pantheon are personified, almost without exception, as lions. The greatest of these is Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of war and plague and the burning eye of the sun. Sekhmet is terrifying. She is the goddess one prays to when one has run out of other gods to pray to. She is, in the myth that Egyptians told themselves, the eye of the sun god Ra, sent down to earth to destroy humankind in punishment, and stopped only when the gods trick her into drinking a great pool of red-dyed beer she mistakes for blood. Beside Sekhmet, in this earliest period, sits another lioness, smaller and lesser known. Her name is Bastet. In the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings we have from Egypt, Bastet is described as a lioness. She protects the pharaoh. She is fierce. She is the kind of goddess one wants on one's side in a fight, and one is very careful not to offend. There is no cat in this picture. The animal at the center of Bastit's earliest cult is the same animal at the center of Sekhmet's, the African lion. Now what happens between the Old Kingdom and the late period is one of the slowest and most quietly remarkable transformations in the history of any religion. Bastet, over roughly 2,000 years, changes her animal. She does not become a different goddess. She keeps her name. She keeps her cult center at Bubastis. She keeps her broad portfolio, protector of the household, of women in childbirth, of the family inside the walls. But the body she puts on, when artists carve her or paint her or cast her in bronze, slowly migrates. By the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 years before Christ, she is sometimes shown with the head of a lioness and sometimes with the head of a smaller, narrower-faced cat. By the New Kingdom, around 1500 years before Christ, the smaller cat is winning. By the time the Greeks first encounter her, in the 7th and 6th centuries before Christ, the transformation is complete. Bastet is now, definitively, the goddess with the head of a domestic cat. Sekhmet keeps the lioness. Bastet has gone home into the kitchen. Why does this happen? Why does a war goddess soften, over 20 centuries, into a household one? I do not know that any single Egyptologist would give you the same answer, but I will give you the answer I find most plausible, and you can hold it loosely as we walk the rest of the chapter. The cat, the actual living animal in the actual Egyptian household, has by this point completed her own long migration from the granary edge, where we found her in chapter 1, into the interior of the home. She is in the courtyard. She is on the bed. She has kittens beside the hearth. The Egyptian word for her, miw, appears in personal names: women called mit, little cat, men called paramiw, the tomcat. She is no longer a useful outdoor animal. She is family. And as the cat moves indoors, the goddess who borrows the cat's face inevitably softens with her. Bastet does not stop being protective. She does not stop being capable, on occasion, of being terrible. But the part of her that protects the household becomes the part the priests emphasize, and the part of her that burned cities becomes the part they let drift back over to Sekhmet. The goddess is, in some sense, taking on the temperament of her animal. Which brings us to Bubastis itself. The city sits in the eastern Nile Delta, in what is now the modern town of Tel Basta, near Zegazig. It has been a settlement since the early Old Kingdom, but by the 22nd dynasty around 950 years before Christ it has become the capital of all Egypt, the seat of pharaohs who name themselves after the goddess. Bubastis grows wealthy. Its great temple to Bastet sits on a low rise at the heart of the city, surrounded on three sides by canals dug from the Nile, with avenues of trees planted along the canal banks. Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century before Christ and saw the temple with his own eyes, says it was the most pleasing of all the temples in Egypt to look upon. He says other temples were taller, and other temples were richer, but no other temple, in his view, was as beautiful as the temple at Bubastis. He describes the temple as standing on an island, because the city around it had been raised over the centuries by debris and rebuilding, while the temple itself was left at its original ground level. So one looked down into the temple from the city, as into a green courtyard at the bottom of a bowl. The cult statue of the goddess sat inside. We have not found the original statue. We have, in our museums, dozens of smaller cult bronzes that probably echoed her form. Now the festival. Herodotus describes it in Book 2 of his Histories, and his account is the most detailed description we have of any Egyptian religious festival, from any source, in any period. The festival of Bastet falls in the spring, at the season of the rising flood. Pilgrims come from every part of Egypt. They come by river barge, whole families, with provisions for the journey and with their own musicians on board. Herodotus says that as the barges pass each town along the Nile, the women on board clap and sing and play castanets, and the men play flutes, and the women on the barges lift their dresses at the women watching from the shore, and there is a great deal of shouting back and forth, and a great deal of mockery, and a great deal of laughter. By the time the barges arrive at Bubastis, the city is full. The temple courtyard is full. The canals are full of moored boats. The pilgrims sacrifice in the temple, and they pray to the goddess, and they feast in the streets. Herodotus says that more wine of the grape is drunk at this one festival than in all the rest of the Egyptian year combined. He says the total number of pilgrims, men and women together, is 700,000. He is, almost certainly, repeating what he was told. The number is the kind of number a guide might give a curious foreigner who has asked how many people come. It means, in the strictest sense, a very great many. But the festival itself, With the barges and the music and the wine and the goddess at the center of it, the festival is real. I want to pause for a moment on what this means. We are talking about a religious festival in the 7th and 6th centuries before Christ, dedicated to a goddess who has the head of a domestic cat, in a city built around that goddess's temple, attended by tens of thousands and possibly hundreds of thousands of pilgrims from across an empire, who travel for days by river to drink wine and play music and feast in honor of an animal that 2,000 years earlier was a sandy stranger at the granary door. The scale of the cat's promotion is sometimes hard to feel in the modern telling, because we have inherited the phrase Egyptians worshipped cats as a kind of historical wallpaper. But Bubastis is not a wallpaper. Bubastis is a city. The temple is real stone. The wine in the cups of the pilgrims is real wine, pressed from grapes grown in the delta the previous autumn. And the goddess being honored, the goddess on whose feast day a working farmer would close his fields and travel 200 miles by river, has the face of an animal that, within living memory in some households, would still come and go through a hole in the wall, and would still, on a quiet night, sleep at the foot of the bed. If you want to see what the cult image of Bastet would have looked like, the closest thing we have, in any museum in the world, is in the British Museum in London. It is a bronze, hollow cast, almost life-size for a domestic cat. She sits upright on her haunches, front paws together, tail wrapped neatly around to her right side. Her ears are pricked. Her eyes look forward. She wears a gold ring through her nose and gold rings through her ears, fitted at the time the statue was made and still there now, still gold, 2,500 years later. On her chest, incised into the bronze, is a winged scarab. The piece is called the Geyer Anderson cat, after the British Army major who donated it in 1939. It was made in the late period, probably in the 26th dynasty, somewhere between 600 and 300 years before Christ. It is almost certainly a cult image, made to sit in a temple or a household shrine. And when you stand in front of it, I have stood in front of it, I am not going to pretend I have not. You understand what the priests at Bubastis were trying to convey. The animal is dignified. The animal is composed. The animal is, in a quiet bronze way, divine. The Geyer Anderson cat is one of perhaps several hundred such bronzes that survive in museum collections around the world. They were made, in their thousands originally, for the booming late-period cult of Bastet. A wealthy pilgrim arriving at Bubastis for the festival might commission one and leave it in the temple as a votive offering. A less wealthy pilgrim might buy a small mass-produced version from a workshop attached to the temple. A still less wealthy pilgrim might bring, and here I want you to hold this thought, because we will pick it up in the very next chapter, a much cheaper kind of offering. A mummified cat. There were, by the late period, a great many of these. In fact there were, by the late period, an extraordinary number of these. Tens of millions of them, by some estimates. And the system that produced them was not what you would expect, and the way some of them ended up, in the late 19th century, was very much not what their original owners can possibly have intended. But that is the next chapter. For now, hold the bronze in your mind. Gold in the ears. Gold in the nose. A winged scarab on the chest. The dignified, composed face of a household animal raised, by 20 centuries of careful attention, to the rank of a goddess. And before we close this chapter, I want to come back, for a moment, to the granary. The cat we left there in chapter 1 was a working animal. She earned her keep with mice. The cat we are leaving you with now, in this chapter, is the same animal biologically, genetically, the same small spotted creature transformed by 2,000 years of slow human attention into the face of a goddess attended by hundreds of thousands of pilgrims drinking wine on the banks of a delta canal. Nothing about the cat herself has changed. The change is entirely in the people. Somewhere in the slow centuries between Moster Jeddah and Bubastis, the Egyptians decided that the small animal that came in from the desert edge was not merely useful but, in some difficult-to-articulate way, sacred. They did not have to. The Romans, when they encountered cats, never made this leap. The Greeks made it only partially. The Egyptians, alone among the great civilizations of antiquity, looked at the cat in the corner of the granary, and decided she was a goddess in disguise. The story of what they did with that decision, the temples, the festivals, the mummies, the laws, the willingness, on at least one famous occasion, to tear a Roman soldier apart for harming one, is the story of the next 4 chapters. The candle in the atelier is still burning. The festival on the canals of Bubastis is still going on, in our minds, where we left it. Stay close. In the spring of 1888, in the dry hills above a village called Beni Hassan, on the east bank of the Nile, a local farmer found a hole in the ground. The hole had been there, presumably, for a very long time, but no one had thought to investigate it. The farmer, perhaps in search of fertilizer for his own fields, climbed down. What he found at the bottom of the hole was a tunnel, and the tunnel led into a chamber, and the chamber led into another chamber, and another, and the chambers, all of them, were full of cats. Not skeletons. Not bones. Mummies. Cat-shaped bundles wrapped tightly in linen, stacked from floor to ceiling, in the hundreds of thousands. Word reached an English entrepreneur. He arranged for the contents of the catacombs to be shipped to England. The cargo, when it arrived at the port of Liverpool, weighed approximately 19 tons. It was auctioned off. The buyer, an agricultural company, ground the cat mummies into fertilizer and spread the resulting powder onto English fields, where it was used to grow, among other things, sugar beets. The story is true. The receipts exist. The auction notice was printed in the local Liverpool papers in February of 1890. Tonight, in this chapter, we are going to walk back along the supply chain that produced those 19 tons. And what we find at the other end of it is going to tell us something about the economy of holiness that I do not think you have quite been told before. We left the Geir Andersen cat in Chapter 2, a hollow cast bronze, gold in the ears, gold in the nose, dignified and composed. The bronze was the offering of a wealthy pilgrim. It was expensive, it was beautiful, it was, by the standards of any ancient temple, a serious gift. But Bubastis, and the other cult centers of Bastet, were not visited only by the wealthy. They were visited, on the days of the festival, by farmers and weavers and brickmakers and laundresses, by every class of person who could afford the time off and the journey downriver. Each of those people wanted to leave something for the goddess. Each of those people could not afford bronze. What the temple complexes therefore developed, over the centuries between roughly the 7th century before Christ and the Roman conquest in 30 before Christ, was a tier of offering that any pilgrim could afford. A mummified cat. The cat would be wrapped in linen, sometimes painted with a cat face on the head end, sometimes elaborately patterned with diamond shapes along the body, and presented in the temple. The priest would receive the offering, bless it, and deposit it in the temple's animal catacomb. The pilgrim would leave with the blessing of the goddess. The economy was, in its broadest outlines, very straightforward. The pilgrim bought a mummy. The temple banked a worshipper. Now think about the volumes involved. If the festival of Bastet drew, by Herodotus's possibly inflated count, 700,000 pilgrims to Bubastis in a single spring, and even a small fraction of them wished to leave a mummy as their offering, the temple required mummies in the tens of thousands every year. Multiply by other cult centers. Saqqara, near Memphis, had its own enormous cat catacombs. Tuna el Jebel, in Middle Egypt, had complexes dedicated to several animal cults. Beni Hassan, where our 19 tons came from, had its own cemetery. Multiply by the 700 years between the rise of the cat cult and the Roman ban. And what you have is a religious supply chain operating at a scale that, until quite recently, no one had really fully appreciated. The current best estimate, drawn from a combination of catacomb excavations and demographic modeling, is that ancient Egyptian temples produced and deposited somewhere on the order of 70 million animal mummies over the course of the cult's lifetime. Of these, the largest single category, by a wide margin, is the cat. Where did all those cats come from? They came, almost certainly, from temple-attached catteries. We have textual and archaeological evidence. The textual evidence is thin and the archaeological evidence is suggestive that the great temples of Bastet maintained their own breeding populations of cats specifically for the mummy trade. The cats lived on the temple grounds. They were fed, sheltered, and tended. And they were killed, in most cases, very young, typically before the age of 1 year, by a deliberate twisting of the neck, a method that leaves a characteristic cervical fracture visible on modern X-rays. This is, I think we have to say plainly, the part of the story that does not sit comfortably alongside the chapter 2 image of the goddess with the dignified composed face and the gold in her ears. The animal whose face was on the cult statue was also the animal being raised, in industrial numbers, on the cult grounds, to be killed and wrapped and sold to pilgrims. Both things were true. The Egyptians do not seem to have found the contradiction troubling. We may, 3,000 years later, find it more so. I am not going to pretend the contradiction does not exist. I am also not going to pretend it makes the Egyptians worse than us. We do not have moral standing, as a species, to be appalled at someone else's relationship with animals. Move on. Once the cat was dead, the mummification process began. For the highest tier of mummies, the ones offered by wealthy pilgrims, or made for particular ritual purposes, the process was elaborate. The internal organs were removed. The body was packed with natron, the sodium salt the Egyptians used to draw out moisture. After 40 days the natron was replaced. The body was then wrapped in successive layers of linen, often patterned, often with a painted cat face on the head end, often with a base or cartonnage casing. The whole process could take 70 days, the same period prescribed for human mummification. For the middle tier of mummies, the process was simpler, a less thorough drying, fewer layers of linen, a less elaborate finish. For the lower tier, which is to say, for most of the mummies, the ones the ordinary pilgrim could afford, the process was, by modern medical imaging standards, remarkable mostly for its corner cutting. And it is the lower tier mummies, when modern radiologists started looking inside them, that produced one of the strangest surprises in the history of Egyptology. Beginning in the 1960s, but accelerating in the 1990s with the spread of medical CT scanning, researchers at museums in London and Manchester and Cairo began routinely imaging cat mummies in their collections. What they expected to find was a cat. What they actually found, in something between a third and two-thirds of the bundles examined, the figure varies by collection and by period, was not a complete cat. In some bundles they found only part of a cat. In some bundles they found bones from 2 or 3 different cats wrapped together to make up the shape. In some bundles they found cat bones mixed with other animal bones. And in a smaller but well-documented number of bundles, they found no cat at all, just sticks, or pebbles, or twisted up linen, or in one famous case from the British Museum collection, a single feather. The wrappings, in every case, had been painted with the standard cat face and patterned with the standard diamond pattern, and would have been completely indistinguishable, to a pilgrim handing one to a priest at the temple gate, from a properly mummified cat. I want to be careful in how I describe this finding, because the popular telling tends toward outrage. The priests were scamming the pilgrims, the temple was running a con. That framing is not quite right, and I do not want to leave you with it. There are several plausible explanations, and the careful Egyptologists, when they discuss the X-ray data, hold all of them at once. One explanation is that demand outran supply. In peak festival seasons, the temple catteries simply could not produce enough kittens, and the priests improvised using partial remains, or fragments, or padding, to meet the volume. A second explanation is that for certain ritual purposes, only a portion of a cat, a specific bone, or a tuft of fur was theologically sufficient, and the linen wrapping made the rest visually consistent. A third explanation is that some of the empty bundles were never meant to deceive at all, that they were symbolic offerings, blessed by the priest in the same way as the full mummies, and that the pilgrim and the priest both knew the bundle was symbolic. And a fourth explanation, which we cannot rule out and which the more pointed historians do not rule out, is that in at least some workshops, in at least some periods, somebody was cutting corners and not telling the buyer. The honest answer is that the evidence supports all four, in different proportions, in different sites. The honest summary is that the system, like every system that scales to industrial volumes, contained within it the full range of human conduct, from the entirely sincere to the entirely cynical, with most of the activity in the broad middle. And now back to Beni Hassan, in 1888, and the 19 tons. The catacombs at Beni Hassan held, by the best modern estimate, somewhere around 300,000 cat mummies, deposited over roughly 5 centuries of cult activity. When the local farmer found the entrance, the news traveled fast. An English broker arranged purchase of the contents. The mummies were loaded onto carts and taken to the river. From the river they went by barge to Alexandria. From Alexandria they went by steamer to Liverpool. At Liverpool they were auctioned off, in lots, to fertilizer companies. The auction notice in the Liverpool Daily Post described the cargo as ancient cat mummies suitable for agricultural use. The buying company paid roughly £4 per tonne. The mummies were then ground bones, linen, painted faces and all into a powder, mixed with other fertilizing agents, and sold to English farmers. We have no idea how many fields, in the Midlands and the home counties, were enriched in the spring of 1890 with the deposited offerings of 2,000 years of Egyptian pilgrims. The number must be in the thousands. I want to leave the image with you for a moment, because it is, if you sit with it, one of the strangest single facts in the history of agricultural soil. Somewhere in the dark loam of an English field, in the spring of 1890, in among the manure and the bone meal and the dried blood from the local abattoir, there were fragments of linen painted with the face of the goddess Bastet, and fragments of bone from kittens raised in temple courtyards on the Nile Delta, and threads of wrapping prepared by priests who would have been astonished to learn the eventual disposal of their work. The mummies were intended to honor the goddess. They were intended to lie undisturbed in the catacombs of Beni Hassan for the long quiet of eternity. They lay there for between 2,300 and 2,600 years. And then, in a span of about 18 months, they were lifted out of the ground, carried by ship across the Mediterranean and the Atlantic edge, ground in a Liverpool mill, and scattered into the soil of a country whose existence the people who had made them could not even have imagined. There is a question I have been carrying with me, while writing this chapter, and I will put it to you now and then let it sit. The cat mummy industry of late-period Egypt is, by any modern standard, an enormous and slightly uncomfortable thing. Tens of millions of small animals raised and killed for the religious economy. Pilgrims handing over what was, for many of them, a meaningful sum of money for what was, in some cases, a bundle of rags. Priests blessing those bundles with what may or may not, in every case, have been a fully informed sincerity. And on the other end of it, in our own era, an industrial-scale fertilizer shipment that ground the offerings of 2,000 years of believers into English farmland. The question I want you to hold, and that we will come back to in the closing chapter, is whether the scale of the cat mummy industry is evidence of a religion in decline, or of a religion at its peak. I do not, I should say, find this question easy. I will tell you, in the final chapter, what I have come to think. For now, hold it loosely. The catacombs at Saqqara and Bubastis and Beni Hassan are full. The pilgrim is at the temple gate. The priest is taking the offering. And in the long quiet of the underground chambers, 300,000 small cat-shaped bundles are lying down, in the dark, to wait. They will wait a long time. The candle is still burning. Stay close. Around the year 60 before Christ, in a city in the Nile Delta, the historian Diodorus Siculus does not tell us which city, and Egyptologists have argued ever since over whether it was Alexandria, or Sais, or somewhere smaller. A Roman soldier, off-duty, walking through a residential quarter, accidentally struck and killed a cat. We do not know the details of the accident. Diodorus, who claims to have been in Egypt at the time and to have witnessed at least part of what followed, does not give us the exact circumstance. He says only that the cat was killed, and that a crowd gathered. Perhaps it had been a chariot wheel. Perhaps a thrown stone. Perhaps the cat had darted out into the street. Whatever the cause, by the time the soldier understood what he had done, people were running. The shouting started. The crowd grew. Within minutes the soldier was surrounded. Egyptian officials arrived, sent by the king himself, with strict instructions to extract the Roman alive, because Egypt at this moment was a client state of Rome, and the killing of a Roman citizen by an Egyptian mob would be, by any sensible diplomatic measure, a catastrophe. The officials tried. Diodorus says they pleaded. They argued. They offered the customary fines. They invoked the king. They could not save him. The crowd dragged the soldier out, and tore him to pieces, and the killing was so quick that the body could not be reassembled. Diodorus says he watched. Tonight, we are going to walk back through that scene and through the question it raises and see what we are actually entitled to conclude. Begin with Diodorus. He is a Greek-speaking historian from Sicily who, in the middle of the 1st century before Christ, writes a 40-volume world history called the Bibliotheca Historica. Only 15 of the 40 volumes survive in full, the rest are in fragments. The first volume of the Bibliotheca is about Egypt. Diodorus tells us, in his own introduction, that he traveled in Egypt himself. He gives us dates that put his visit somewhere around 60 to 56 before Christ, in the long messy reign of Ptolemy XII, the father of Cleopatra. He tells us that he questioned priests, examined monuments, and personally observed the customs he describes. By the standards of ancient historiography, this is good provenance. He is not, like Herodotus, a writer collecting marvelous stories from a culture he visited briefly. He is, by ancient standards, a serious researcher who spent months on the ground. And in Book 1, Chapter 83, he gives us the cat passage. He says the Egyptians regard certain animals as sacred: cats, ibises, hawks, crocodiles. He says the penalty for killing any one of these animals deliberately is death. He says the penalty for killing one accidentally is, in most cases, also death, although the local courts will sometimes impose only a fine. And then he tells us the story of the Roman soldier, as evidence. Now what do we do with this? The first instinct, the popular instinct, is to take Diodorus at his word and conclude that in late period and Ptolemaic Egypt the killing of a cat was a capital crime under formal Egyptian law. This is the version of the story that has come down to us in the museum placards and the popular books and the documentary scripts of the last 100 years. It is also, when one looks at the actual surviving Egyptian legal evidence, not quite supported. We have a reasonable corpus of surviving Egyptian legal documents from the late period and Ptolemaic period contracts, court records, royal decrees, and in that corpus we have, as best Egyptologists can determine, no surviving statute that prescribes death for killing a cat. We have decrees protecting sacred animals attached to specific temples. We have penalties for theft from temple grounds. We have the customary fines Diodorus mentions. We do not have, as a clean piece of statute law, the death penalty for killing a household cat. So either the law existed and we have not yet found it, or Diodorus is describing not a statute but a custom, or Diodorus is misunderstanding the legal status of what he saw. The careful historians, when they discuss this passage, hold all three possibilities open. I want to give you the position I find most plausible, and you can argue with it as we walk forward. I think what Diodorus saw was not the operation of formal Egyptian law, but the operation of something we might call religious crowd action. In any society where a particular animal is regarded as sacred, the killing of that animal even accidentally creates a violent communal response that the formal legal system has no choice but to accommodate. The Egyptian officials in the Diodorus story are not, on this reading, trying to save the soldier from a court that has not yet convicted him. They are trying to save him from a crowd that has already decided. The king's instruction to bring him out alive is an instruction to manage the crowd. The reason the officials fail is that the crowd is, in that moment, the sovereign in the street and the formal authorities know it. This pattern, by the way, is not unique to Egypt. We see versions of it in any society where religious sentiment runs deep in late antique Constantinople, in medieval European responses to sacrilege, in the modern world too. Diodorus is describing the operation, in Egyptian terms, of a phenomenon that the careful student of religion will recognize from many cultures. And there is a second piece of evidence, 2 centuries older than Diodorus, that I think pushes us toward this reading. Herodotus, the Greek historian who wrote about Egypt in the 5th century before Christ, gives us a passage about what Egyptians did when a household cat died. He says they mourned the cat with extraordinary intensity. He says they shaved their eyebrows, as a sign of grief, whereas the death of a dog, he says, prompted them to shave their entire bodies. And then he gives us a still stranger passage. He says that when a fire broke out in an Egyptian house, the household would not, as you might expect, race to put out the fire. They would, instead, race to keep the cats from running back into the fire. He says they would stand in a ring around the burning house, holding hands or holding torches, and if a cat slipped past them and ran into the flames, they would let the house burn rather than chase the cat. He says they grieved the loss of a cat in a house fire more than the loss of the house itself. I want to be careful again. Herodotus is, by any honest measure, a less reliable witness than Diodorus. He is writing about Egypt from a single relatively short visit. He is collecting stories from local guides who, in some cases, are clearly telling him what they think will entertain a foreigner. The Cat in the Fire story has the flavor of a tale told for effect. It is also, structurally, not the same kind of evidence as the Diodorus mob. Herodotus is reporting a generalized custom. Diodorus is reporting a particular event he says he witnessed. But the two passages, set side by side, suggest something coherent. The Egyptian relationship to the cat, in the popular and religious life of the country, was emotionally and ritually intense in a way that did not depend on, and possibly was not codified in, formal law. The cat was protected not because the king said so but because the household, the neighborhood, and the temple all said so, with a unanimity that the king found it politically necessary to honor. The Roman soldier in 60 before Christ, accidentally killing a cat in the wrong street, ran into the operation of that unwritten consensus. The king's officials could not save him because the king's officials, by the standards of the moment, did not actually outrank the crowd around the body. Now, against this reading, I want to give a fair hearing to the alternative, which is the more straightforward reading that Diodorus is telling us, plainly, that the killing of a cat was a capital crime in Egyptian law, and we should believe him. The case for this reading is not weak. Diodorus is a careful writer. He was on the ground. He had access to priests and to local informants. He says, explicitly, that the penalty for killing a sacred animal, including a cat, was death. He does not present this as a description of crowd action. He presents it as a description of the law. If we are going to set aside what an ancient historian explicitly tells us he found, we ought to have a stronger reason than the absence, after 2,000 years of cultural and physical destruction, of a particular late-period statute in our surviving fragments of the Egyptian legal corpus. The honest summary is that there is no smoking gun statute that requires us to disbelieve Diodorus, and there is a witness on the ground who says he saw it. The careful historian holds the alternative possibility open. But the careful historian also does not insist on a reading the surviving evidence does not require. Either way, what we can say with confidence is that the cat in late-period Egypt was an animal whose accidental killing could produce a public response severe enough that a Roman client king's officials could not contain it. That is, by any measure, an extraordinary social fact. Most animals, in most cultures, in most periods, do not carry that weight. The dog does not carry it in Egypt. The crocodile does, in a few places. The hawk does, in others. But the cat carries it nearly everywhere in Egypt for nearly 700 years. Whatever the legal mechanism, formal statute or unwritten consensus or some combination of the two, the practical reality is that you did not, in late-period Egypt, kill a cat by accident on a public street and walk away. The Romans, after the formal annexation of Egypt by Augustus in 30 before Christ, will eventually impose Roman law and the cat will lose its formal religious protections. But the social residue lingers. The Roman writer Aelian, 2 centuries after the formal annexation, will still describe Egyptians as treating cats with a reverence he finds, as a Roman, slightly comic and slightly alarming. The Egyptians will absorb the joke, and then continue to treat their cats more or less as they always have, into the early Christian period and beyond. I want to leave you, before we close the chapter, with the soldier himself, because I think we owe him at least a moment of attention. Diodorus does not give us his name. He does not give us his rank. He does not give us his unit, or the legion he had been attached to, or the city he came from in Italy. We do not know whether he had been in Egypt for years or for a week. We do not know whether he understood, when he saw the cat in front of his foot, what he was about to do. We do not know whether he meant well by it, or whether he panicked when he realized, or whether he tried to apologize before the first stone was thrown. What Diodorus gives us is the bare outline. A Roman soldier accidentally killed a cat in a street in Egypt around 60 before Christ. A crowd formed. The king sent officials. The officials failed. The soldier was killed. And the story has come down to us, 2086 years later, as the cleanest available data point on the question of what the cat meant, in this country, in this period, when one was actually, on a particular afternoon, killed. And then, only 30 years later, Egypt itself stops being an independent kingdom. Cleopatra dies in 30 before Christ. Augustus annexes the country. The Ptolemaic dynasty ends. The temples remain, the priests remain, the catacombs at Saqqara and Bubastis and Beni Hassan continue to receive offerings for at least another 2 centuries, but the political fact at the top of the system has changed. The cat is still, in the Egyptian street, an animal of weight. The legal and ritual scaffolding around her is beginning to bend. By the time the early Christian writers begin describing Egypt, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ, the great cult of Bastet is being absorbed into the broader Mediterranean syncretism, and the official religion of the empire is beginning its long pivot toward the church. The cat will survive the pivot. The temples will not. The next chapter is going to walk us back, briefly, to a battle that may or may not have happened on the eastern edge of the Egyptian delta, more than 400 years before the Roman soldier was killed in the street. The battle, if it happened, involved cats in a way that no other recorded battle in any war in any period has ever involved them. Or it did not. It is one of the great open questions in the historical literature. The candle in the atelier is still burning. The river is still high. Stay close. In the year 525 before Christ, a Persian army under the command of King Cambyses II crossed the eastern desert and arrived at the gates of an Egyptian fortress city called Pelusium, on the easternmost mouth of the Nile. The Egyptians, under their pharaoh Psamtik III, met them in the field outside the walls. There was a battle. The Persians won. The city fell. The pharaoh was captured, and within a few months Egypt, which had stood as an independent kingdom for more than 2,500 years, became a province of the Persian Empire. This much is established. It is in our better sources. It is consistent with the archaeological evidence and with the surviving Persian and Egyptian records. The Battle of Pelusium is one of the more thoroughly documented turning points of the 6th century before Christ. What is not established and what tonight's chapter is going to walk through carefully, because it is one of the most repeated cat stories in any popular history of antiquity, is the claim that Cambyses won the battle by means of cats. Specifically, that he painted the image of the goddess Bastet on the front of his soldiers' shields, and drove herds of sacred animals, cats first among them, ahead of his lines as he advanced, knowing that the Egyptian archers would not loose a single arrow for fear of harming a single one of them, and thus delivering Pelusium into his hands without resistance. The story is famous. The story is told and retold. The story is almost certainly not true. Tonight we are going to ask why. Begin with the source. The story of Cambyses and the cats does not appear in Herodotus. Herodotus, who wrote about the Persian conquest of Egypt within a century of the event, who had access to Egyptian and Persian and Greek informants, who describes the Battle of Pelusium in Book 3 of his histories in some detail. Herodotus does not mention the cats. He does not mention painted shields. He does not mention sacred animals driven ahead of the lines. He describes a conventional battle, won by Persian numbers and Persian discipline, and a conventional siege that followed. The cat story does not appear in any other near-contemporary source either. It does not appear in the Persian inscriptions. It does not appear in the Greek historians of the 5th and 4th centuries before Christ, not in Thucydides, not in Xenophon, not in the various authors of the Persica. It does not appear in any Egyptian record we have. The earliest place it appears, anywhere, in any language, is in the writings of a Macedonian author called Polyaenus, in a work called Stratagems of War, composed around the year 160 after Christ. Polyaenus is writing roughly 685 years after the battle. I want to be honest about what Polyaenus is, because the framing of the question depends on it. Polyaenus is not a historian in the sense that Herodotus and Thucydides are. He is not, in his own description, trying to reconstruct what actually happened in particular battles. He is, in his own description, compiling clever military tricks from across the history of the Greek and Roman and barbarian worlds, for the practical use of the two emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, to whom he dedicates the book, on the eve of their war against Parthia. His project is the project of a collector of stratagems. He pulls his material from everywhere, from histories he has read, from rhetorical exercises taught in the Greek schools, from local oral traditions, from older compilations now lost. He does not name his sources for the Cambyses anecdote. He does not say where he got it. He simply presents it, as one of 900 or so collected stratagems, as an example of a clever general using local religious sensibilities against an enemy who could not bring himself to fight back. The story is, structurally, perfect for Polyaenus's purpose. It is also, by the standards we apply to Herodotus, very late and very thinly attested. So what do we conclude? The careful Egyptologist's position, and I will give it to you straight, is that the cat shield story is almost certainly an invention, or at most a heavily embellished folk memory, layered onto an actual Persian victory. The reasoning is not exotic. We have a much better source, Herodotus, writing within a century, who knew Egypt and knew Persia and would not have left out a detail this colorful if it had been in any of his informants' accounts. We have a much weaker source, Polyenus, writing 7 centuries later, in a genre that valued clever stories over verified ones, with no named sources of his own. When the two disagree, when one of them has the detail and the other does not, the historical method, applied honestly, goes with the earlier and stronger witness. The story is not in Herodotus. The story is in Polyenus. The story is, in all probability, something that grew up between the two of them. And yet, and this is the part that makes the chapter worth doing carefully, the story is not, even on the assumption that it is invented, uninteresting. It is, in fact, evidence of a different kind. It is not evidence of what Cambyses did in 525 before Christ. It is evidence of what a literate Mediterranean audience, in 160 after Christ, believed about Egypt and its cats. By the 2nd century after Christ, Egypt has been under Roman rule for nearly 200 years. The cult of Bastet is still operating, but it is in decline. The cat mummy industry, which we walked through in Chapter 3, is past its peak. The story about Cambyses, on this reading, is what the late Roman world imagines an Egypt at the height of its cat cult would have looked like, a country so committed to the sanctity of the animal that its own soldiers would lay down their bows rather than risk a stray arrow striking a single cat in a Persian shield line. The story is a kind of cultural fossil. It is not a fossil of the battle. It is a fossil of how the battle was being remembered, embellished, and weaponized, by writers using ancient Egypt as a setting for the kind of story they wanted to tell. I will tell you the version Polyenus gives, in his own framing, so you have heard it in something like its original form. He says that Cambyses, knowing the Egyptians' devotion to certain sacred animals, ordered his soldiers to carry images of those animals on the fronts of their shields as they advanced on Pelusium. He also, and this is the detail that has fixed itself most firmly in the popular telling, caused live animals to be driven in front of the Persian line as it advanced. Cats, dogs, ibises, sheep. Polyenus does not say how the Persians managed to herd a mixed-species column of skittish animals across an active battlefield. He does not say what happened to the animals when the lines closed. He says only that the Egyptian archers, faced with the prospect of injuring even one of the sacred creatures, refused to draw their bows. The Persian line walked, on Polyenus's telling, more or less unopposed up to the Egyptian position. The pharaoh's army broke. Pelusium fell. Cambyses entered Egypt. The cats, in Polyenus's telling, won the war. There are several specific reasons, beyond the absence of the detail in Herodotus, to be skeptical of the story as a literal account. The first is logistical. Herding a column of cats across a battlefield is, anyone who has lived with a cat will tell you, not a project that any competent general would attempt. Cats do not herd. They scatter. They climb. They hide. The Persian army would have spent the morning chasing them through the rocks. The second is military. Herodotus describes the Battle of Pelusium as a hard-fought infantry engagement, with cavalry on both sides, that the Persians won by weight of numbers and by superior tactical positioning. He gives details. He names commanders. He describes the aftermath. There is no space, in his account, for a Persian advance unopposed by Egyptian arrows. The third is documentary. The cat story would have been, for an Egyptian author writing about the conquest, an unbearable national humiliation the country brought down not by force but by its own piety. We have surviving Egyptian responses to the Persian conquest, mostly bitter, mostly recriminatory, mostly assigning blame to particular Egyptian commanders or to the gods themselves. None of them mention the cats. If the story had been even a folk memory in Egypt itself, it would, almost certainly, have left some trace in the Egyptian record. It did not. And so we land on the position the careful historians have held, for at least the last 40 years, on this question. The Battle of Pelusium happened. Cambyses won. Egypt fell. The Persian conquest was, by every measure available to us, a conventional military victory by a larger and better supplied army over a smaller and less prepared one. The cat shield story is, almost certainly, a later embellishment, picked up by Polyaenus in the 2nd century after Christ from a tradition we cannot now trace, and preserved by him because it suited his project of compiling clever stratagems for the use of 2 Roman emperors. It is not, in all likelihood, what happened. It is, on the other hand, what at least one literate writer 6 centuries later thought might have happened, in a country whose devotion to its cats had become, by his time, the kind of thing one could plausibly hang a battlefield story on. The popular telling has, ever since, preferred the Polyaenus version. The popular telling will probably continue to prefer it, because the Polyaenus version is much more fun, and because the careful version requires the reader to keep 2 pieces of evidence in mind at once. The popular version requires only one. The popular version, like most popular versions, wins on simplicity. I do want to give the popular version one last fair hearing, because the absence of evidence is not, by itself, evidence of absence. It is possible, and I will say this carefully, that Cambyses did employ some local intelligence about Egyptian religious sensibilities, and did instruct his army to display certain symbols, and that Herodotus simply did not pick the detail up, or chose not to include it because it complicated the conventional military narrative he was constructing. It is possible that Polyaenus had access to a source we no longer have. It is possible. The honest historian does not insist, at the level of philosophical certainty, that the cat shield story is false. The honest historian only says that the evidence for it is very thin, that the evidence against the embellishment surviving in the better sources is significant, and that the burden of proof is on whoever wishes to make the affirmative claim that this is what happened. So far, no scholar working on the Persian conquest has met that burden. Until one does, the cat shield story belongs in the same category as the various other clever stratagem anecdotes Polyaenus collected interesting, possibly grounded in something, not safe to build a chapter on without acknowledging the limits. We have walked, over 5 chapters, from a single grave in a predynastic village called Mosta Jeddah, in the year 5500 before Christ, through the rise of the goddess Bastet at her temple in Bubastis, through the industrial cat mummy trade and the 19 tons that arrived in Liverpool in 1888, through the Roman soldier killed in an Egyptian street, and through a battlefield story about painted shields that almost certainly did not happen. Tonight, in this last chapter, we are going to walk the rest of the way home. Not by way of another piece of ancient writing. Not by way of another temple or another tomb. By way of a laboratory. In the last 20 years, 2 new tools have arrived in Egyptology that have rewritten what we can know about these animals. The first is the high-resolution CT scanner, which can image the contents of a wrapped cat mummy without unwrapping it. The second is the ancient DNA laboratory, which can extract genetic material from a single tooth pulled from a single mummy 3,000 years dead, and read it. Tonight we are going to walk through what those tools have told us. And then, because every long chapter deserves a closer that earns it, we are going to walk all the way back to the granary, and then forward to a couch in a house in our own century, and we are going to ask what the line between the 2 of them actually is. Begin with the DNA. In the year 2017, a team of researchers led by Claudio Ottoni at the University of Leuven published a paper in the journal Nature Ecology and Evolution. The paper was the result of 7 years of work. The team had collected, with the cooperation of museums and archaeological projects across Europe and Africa and the Near East, samples from over 200 ancient cats, the oldest dating to around 9,000 years before Christ, the youngest from the 18th century after Christ. They had extracted mitochondrial DNA from each sample, sequenced it, and compared the sequences against one another and against modern domestic cats. What they were looking for was the genetic signature of domestication, where it began, how it spread, and what trajectories it followed across the long history of the Mediterranean and the Old World. What they found was not what the older textbooks had said. The older textbooks said that the domestic cat had a single origin in ancient Egypt, around 1500 years before Christ, and spread from there. The DNA said something more interesting. What the DNA said was that there were 2 founding populations, not one. The first founding population, which the team called Lineage A, originated somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, probably in the broad region of the modern Levant and southern Anatolia, around 7500 years before Christ. This lineage was associated with the rise of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent. The cats of lineage A appear in the genetic record alongside the first farming villages, the same villages where, around the same time, we see the founding bargain we talked about in Chapter 1, the small spotted wildcat coming in from the desert edge to hunt the mice in the grain stores. The Mostegedda cat, when sampled, belonged to this lineage. The second founding population, which the team called Lineage C, originated in Egypt itself, around 1500 years before Christ, the New Kingdom period, the time of the Nebuchadnezzar tomb painting we mentioned in Chapter 1, when the cat had already moved fully into the Egyptian household. Lineage C, the Egyptian lineage, then spread along Mediterranean trade routes, into Greece and Rome and on into northern Europe, over the first millennium before Christ and the first millennium after. I want to pause on what this means, because it is more important than it sounds when one says it in a single sentence. Every domestic cat alive in the world today, the one on the couch, the one at the back door, the one in the alley, the feral colonies in the railway yards and the millions in private homes, carries one or both of these two ancestral lineages. The cat that purrs in a London flat in the 21st century descends, genetically, from a small founding population that came in from the desert edge at the dawn of agriculture, mixed over centuries with a second population that emerged in Egypt during the New Kingdom, and was carried along the same Mediterranean trade routes that carried wine and copper and grain and, eventually, the ideas of Greek philosophy. The cat is a passenger on the same network. She is, in this sense, one of the longest traveled, most widely distributed, most quietly successful domesticates in the history of any human society. The reason she is on every continent now is that she was, 3,500 years ago, on every ship in the Mediterranean. The Egyptians did not invent her. But they did, in the most consequential way, distribute her. Now the CT scans. We talked, in Chapter 3, about the radiological imaging of the cat mummies in museum collections, and the surprising finding that a substantial fraction of them did not contain a complete cat. In the years since that program of work began, the same imaging techniques have been applied to fresh mummies as they have come out of the ground. Which brings us to a particular November day in the year 2019, at the site of the Bubastion at Saqqara, the Great Cat Catacombs near Memphis, the same complex we walked through in Chapter 3. A team led by Mustafa Waziri, then the Secretary-General of the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities, opened a previously unexplored tomb at the edge of the necropolis. Inside, on the first day, they found the things one expects to find. Dozens of mummified cats, wrapped in linen, stacked in the chamber. Statues of cats in bronze and in wood, of varying sizes, some still bearing traces of paint. Scarab statues. A handful of crocodile mummies, also expected, also unsurprising. And then, deeper in the chamber, the team found something that had never, in the long history of Egyptian animal cult excavation, been found before. Big cats. Not all of the mummies in the chamber were domestic cats. Several, the initial count was 5, later excavations suggested possibly more, were lion cubs. The team confirmed the identification first by external examination, then by CT imaging that showed the characteristic skeletal proportions of juvenile African lions rather than domestic cats. The mummies were small. The cubs had been young when they died, probably less than a year, possibly considerably less. They had been wrapped with the same care, in the same kinds of linen, with the same painted faces, as the cat mummies in the adjoining stacks. They were the first confirmed lion mummies from ancient Egypt. The discovery was announced in late 2019 and the academic publication followed in 2021. What it tells us is not, on its own, a sweeping historical revision. But it does tell us that the Egyptian cult of Bastet, which had begun, you will remember from Chapter 2, as a lioness goddess before it softened into the domestic cat goddess, had retained, into the late period, some ritual memory of the lioness origin. The big cat had not been entirely replaced by the small one. In the right kind of chamber, at the right moment, both could be offered. And what about the mummies themselves, the cat mummies, the ordinary cat mummies, the ones that filled the chambers at Saqqara and Bubastis and Beni Hassan in the millions? What does the modern imaging and the modern DNA work tell us about them? It tells us, first, that the cats were young, almost all of them, as we said in Chapter 3, killed before their first birthday. It tells us that they were healthy at the time of death, The bones do not show signs of starvation or significant disease. It tells us, from the DNA, that they belonged predominantly to lineage C, the Egyptian lineage consistent with the picture of temple-attached breeding colonies producing the kittens specifically for the votive trade. It tells us, from isotope analysis of the bones, that the cats had been fed a particular diet, often heavy in fish and grain byproducts, consistent with the diet of an animal raised in a settled temple environment rather than living off the wild rodent population of the countryside. It tells us, from CT imaging of the cervical vertebrae, the characteristic fracture pattern of the deliberate neck twist we mentioned in Chapter 3, the same method, used over and over again across the centuries of the cult. The mummies, taken as a body of evidence, describe an industry. Not a romantic one. Not a sentimental one. An industry, run with professional consistency, for a particular purpose, over hundreds of years. I want to pull these threads together, because we have walked a long way and we owe the story a synthesis. The cat in Egypt was, in chronological order, 4 things. She was, first, a working animal in a predynastic granary, a small spotted hunter who came in from the desert edge to catch the mice and stayed because the food was good. She became, second, a household member under the bed, under the chair, in the courtyard, in the family. She became, third, the face of a goddess transformed over 20 centuries from a lioness war deity into the domestic protector of Bubastis, attended by hundreds of thousands of pilgrims on a delta canal. And she became, fourth, a votive object bred and killed and wrapped and deposited in the millions by an industry that scaled to match the demand of the cult. None of these 4 roles cancels the others. All of them coexist. The same animal who is on the cult statue, gold in her ears, gold in her nose, is also the animal in the catacomb wrapped in plain linen, and the animal in the kitchen with the kittens, and the animal in the granary still doing the work she was first kept for. The story is not, in the end, one thing. It is the long-layered history of one species' particular partnership with one civilization. I told you, at the end of Chapter 3, that I would tell you what I had come to think about the cat mummy industry. Whether it was, in its scale and its industrial character, evidence of a religion in decline or a religion at its peak. The honest answer, having walked through the rest of the evidence, is that it was both. The industrial scale of the cult was a sign that the cult was reaching every social class, that even the poorest pilgrim could afford an offering, and that the temple was meeting that demand. That is, by any reasonable measure of a religion's reach, a sign of strength. But the scale also meant that the offerings themselves became standardized, mass-produced, in some cases hollow, that the relationship between the individual pilgrim and the individual offering thinned. That is, by the standards of any careful student of religious history, a sign of late-stage routinization. The cat mummy industry of late-period Egypt is, in that sense, the same thing many large successful religious systems become at their peak. Enormously available. Slightly overstretched. Real in the moment of the pilgrim's offering. Slightly suspect in the bookkeeping behind it. Both. Together. At the same time. It is the kind of finding the careful student of history learns to accept without forcing it into a single judgment. The religion was at its peak. The religion was beginning to fray. The 2 facts are the same fact. And so we close where the story has been heading from the beginning. The cat in the granary at Mostageda, in the year 5500 before Christ, was a small spotted hunter who had come in from the desert edge to catch the mice. 7,500 years later, in a city in the modern world, in London, or in Cairo, or in Indianapolis, or in whatever city the person hearing this is sitting in, there is, in many of those homes, a cat on a couch. She is, in the strict genetic sense, the same animal. Her mitochondrial line runs back, unbroken, through the trade routes of the Mediterranean, through the temples of the Nile Delta, through the breeding colonies of the Bubastion, through the household courtyards of the New Kingdom, through the granary edge of the predynastic, all the way to the small wild population that walked in toward the first stored grain. She does not know any of this. She has been on the couch since dinner. She is asleep on a folded blanket, with one paw tucked under her chin and the other stretched out in front of her, and she is breathing slowly, and the room is warm, and the lamp is low. The history is on the page. The cat is on the couch. The room is quiet. Sleep well.